Are we live?
You're live.
It's already running?
Yes.
Oh, yes, all right. Okay. Well, let's get started. Hey, welcome to the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm Patrick from the Poison Pen staff, and it's always a treat to welcome Jeff Guinn back to the store. Lots to talk about, lots of different subjects, from Manson to Jonestown. But for our purposes this evening, we're going to focus on these three wonderful Western historical novels. Silver City is the new book, and they're just, as you know, they're just packed with all kinds of fun Western historical lore, lots of true history in these books.
Hopefully,
Yeah. Well, please help me give them a warm welcome to the store. All right. Just as I said, this is book 3 in the series, and we cover a lot of ground in these 3 books. Can you just kind of give us maybe a brief catch-up to first synopsis of the first 2 books and get us up to where we are in this book?
Sure. I mean, this is a Western trilogy, and it follows what I guess you would call the misadventures of a man named Cash McClendon, who in the first book finds himself running from St. Louis, where a vengeful father-in-law has sent an enforcer named Killer Boots after him and chases him into Arizona territory, where Cash has gone to try to reconnect with his old lover, a woman named Gabrielle, who he threw over stupidly for a rich girl and now regrets it. The concept of the trilogy is we're trying to bring readers the real history, the real feeling of the frontier in 1872, 1873, 1874. We want to have Cash and our fictional characters interact with people right out of history who look like they looked, who will talk like they talked. And the first 2 books have built the story arc. The purpose of any 3rd book in a trilogy is to finish off these story arcs for readers, satisfy their questions about what is going to happen. That doesn't mean you stop the series there. But if a reader has stuck with the trilogy this long, you want to make all the big questions get answered. And of course, you also want to write it as a standalone book, so that if people haven't read the first 2, they can sort of pick up the 3rd and keep on going. But Silver City is an attempt to kind of wrap up this first cycle and let readers start thinking what might happen next.
And Cash McClendon, can you tell us a little bit about him? Where does that particular character come from?
When I was first asked if I wanted to write this series, I wondered what I could bring to Western fiction that maybe isn't quite as common. And as somebody who grew up on the ubiquitous Western TV shows of the 1950s and the early 1960s, just loved that stuff. But a lot of the Western fiction we get basically has the same plot. Our protagonist can outfight and outshoot anyone, and he will either gun down about 100 bank robbers or cattle rustlers in the climactic scene, or the 10,000 Indians who came boiling over the hill will sort of fall to his 6-shooter, which somehow he never has to reload. And at the end of the book, the schoolmarm will run up and throw her arms around him, and they will live happily ever after. And I found myself thinking, if we really want readers to get a sense of the frontier, the way it really was, as opposed to sort of our cowboy TV mythology, then the protagonist ought to be somebody coming into the frontier who has no skill whatsoever. Can't ride a horse, isn't sure what part of the gun you point at somebody, and even is a little bit put off by the lack of indoor facilities in the Old West. And so Cash McClendon is really letting me and letting the readers sort of see through his eyes this whole different experience. Now, he is not going to win by any fabulous feats of marksmanship or strength, but he is going to try to muddle his way through. And first we take him in glorious to 1872 and some of the first mining in Arizona Territory for silver in parts of the country that are a little more dangerous than you figured. We try to bring in the whole Native American movement, the last sort of spasms of great warfare in the Southwest, and that was the Battle of Adobe Walls. And that basically made Little Bighorn look like a skirmish. And now in Silver City, what I wanted to do was take that wonderful sort of generic idea, the pursuit across the desert, time's running out, what will happen, and put a few different twists on it and maybe make it a little more realistic. So the Cash McClendon we're seeing in this book has learned a lot in the first two, but he's still kind of a schmuck. And he is still, his feet are still tender, and it's always going to be a question of whether he can barely stagger through and survive or not, and this time he might not.
Has anybody read those wonderful books by George MacDonald Fraser, the Flashman books? Were those books at all inspirational to you? I mean, if you haven't read them, the conceit is, you know, this womanizer, coward, rake, ne'er-do-well manages to escape from all these decisive moments in European and American history. It's a great idea.
Oh, I think it is, but I also think it's probably true if Cash and Flashman ever threw down.
Cashman.
Yeah, could be. All of us, I think, are a little bit inspired by books we read and really enjoy, and certainly that series was something I liked a whole lot. I would say if there's one book that really influenced me most in terms of the stage and the scene setting, it would be a wonderful book called Blood Brothers by Elliot Arnold. And I still think in terms of his descriptions of Arizona Territory and so forth, it's absolutely magnificent. So anybody who's read my series and likes it a lot, I urge you, come to the Poison Pen Bookstore and ask them to order you, if they don't have it in stock, a copy of Elliot Arnold's book, because you're going to love it.
And that's the story of Cochise and Tom Jeffords, correct?
Right, or as my 12-year-old publicist up in New York liked to call him Cochise.
Cochise. Yeah, and in the film you remember, wasn't Cochise played by some Italian-looking guy?
Well, we all know that Cochise looked exactly like Michael Ain't Center, so we don't have to talk about that.
What was the name of that book?
Blood Brother.
My Brother?
Blood Brothers.
Blood Brother. Okay.
But you really, I urge you, please find it and read it. It's wonderful.
Right. Let's see here. You know, you talk about the great the chase, the long adventure, sort of the epic throughout the West. I know that I wanted to ask you a little bit about this character, Killer Boots.
Killer Boots.
Patrick Brodigan, who's just kind of like the ultimate hired mercenary assassin, badass kind of guy. Reading some of the accounts from that era of the Pinkertons, you
Right.
know, and how tenacious they were, and you know, they'd go on these epic chases. Was that in some way inspirational for him?
I think probably the inspiration for Killer Boots were some of the railroad toughs.
Okay.
As the Intercontinental Railroad had actually come into being, and the sort of thugs that were employed to keep everything running smoothly and on the up and up. But with Killer Boots, I wanted to do two things. First, I really wanted him to be menacing, and I hope he is. And he's, in the first book, glorious, but in a way he's kind of like the great white shark in the movie Jaws. You only see him a little bit at a time until the big finish, and that makes him even scarier. We kind of imagine what he's up to. He's rarely glimpsed in the middle book, but I always knew that to conclude this trilogy, one way or another, Cash McClendon and Killer Boots are going to face each other. And so for the first time, I had to make this character, even as intimidating as he is, a human being. He's not used to the frontier either. And so when we write about Patrick Brodigan, and he's trying to ride a horse across the desert, and when he gets off the horse the first few nights, he can hardly walk, and there's chafing in his thighs and everything else. that humanizes him a little. Of course, the fact he likes to kick people to death with his steel-toed boots, we all have our flaws.
Nobody's perfect. You know?
Well, but it's such great fun inventing a villain. And in this book, I try to give him a sidekick. And of all the real characters in history that are throughout these books, I bring back in Silver City one who starred in Glorious. Best thing in the world about Ike Clayton was that in real life, he was so stupid and so mean and so constantly drunk. There was nothing he wouldn't do. And for a novelist, that's great. I just throw him in here. And anything horrible I need done, Ike is there. And he's happy to oblige. So wherever the spirit of Ike Clayton is, I'm grateful, buddy.
So just setting the book up, it starts in St. Louis briefly, where Brodigan is given a task. McClendon, after kind of being in the wind for a while, eluding Brodigan, the first time he's ever not caught his quarry, he learns that he's been spotted in Mountain View.
Mountain View, which, by the way, in real life might be called Globe.
Globe, that's what I was going to ask. Yeah. And so he sets off for Arizona. And talk a little bit about, one of the things that these books do so well is, again, capturing the details, the dirt, the pain. We were just talking before about, how soft we are these days, and reading about what some of these characters go through on a daily basis. What was some of your historical research like? Was it reading diaries and accounts from the period?
I got a lot of my ideas for this book a few years ago when I was writing a nonfiction book called The Last Gunfight, which was about the shootout at the OK Corral, which was really not a shootout and didn't happen in the OK Corral. But other than that, the name shootout at the OK Corral is perfectly accurate. But I was so struck as I learned what Tombstone had really been like. We start thinking of it as sort of this desert, ramshackle place with tumbleweeds rolling down Main Street. And then you learn that it had a baseball team, a baseball nine with uniforms. There was a racetrack. There was an ice cream parlor. And what I love most, there was a bowling alley.
It's the telling detail.
Well, that's the kind of thing. I want readers to be entertained in this book. I want them to be engrossed by the action. But I don't think there's anything wrong with having a few little surprises there that actually are historically accurate. So when Cash shows up at Mountain View and he needs to find some work, he ends up helping run a one-lane bowling alley in the back of a feed store. And so far, particularly in interviews I've done for radio and some TV for this book, the first question is always this: oh, come on, there really weren't bowling alleys. You made that up. And no, I didn't. And that's what I loved about doing the research, and that's what I love about real frontier history. It's got so many wonderful surprises for us if we'll just try to get past all the mythology. And so I'm proud perhaps to be the one who has placed a bowling alley on the frontier for readers everywhere. If that's what's on my tombstone, it will be an accomplishment.
Now, is it fun kind of, when you go back and read newspaper accounts, the style of the journalism of the day?
Very much so.
Yes.
And in this book, we have in Mountain View a fellow who is trying to get a paper started, a weekly newspaper. And you won't believe this. I mean, that a journalist would try to exaggerate things, sensationalize stories. So you've got some garish headlines that might sell some newspapers. Never actually happened in history, of course. One of the things in this book, from the journalism to the economic drive and the ambition, to a lot of the political disagreements, we always tend to think whatever is happening today is brand new, and history is cyclical.
Actually, no. Maybe today, no, I'm just going to say.
It's okay.
No.
But writing about a newspaper in 1874 trying to get started. I mean, you can look at the daily papers today and a lot of the same thing is still happening. I mean, human nature doesn't change. Some of the technology does, some of the places in which we find ourselves is different. But I really want readers to get the feeling these just aren't one-dimensional characters who could never have existed like this and had these personalities at any time but 1874. I mean, some of them could be sitting among us today and probably are.
Well, it's interesting because in the last, like some of these iconic figures, like you write about in The Last Gunfight, but also, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, the list goes on and on. There's been, in the last, 15, 20 years, these wave of new books that kind of reassess their place in history. Because a lot of the early classic ones were written in the 30s and 40s. And that's fascinating to go back and try to excavate the real West underneath the mythology.
Well, you have to know, though, going in when you do that there are going to be people who resist it.
Of course.
There are always going to be people who, if they want to believe something, are going to, and anything presented to them that's different will be attacked as revisionist, or perhaps is something that, okay, so you say you've got facts, but we have alternative facts. Writing about Wyatt Earp in The Last Gunfight, he was not a terrible person at all. He was a man of his time, but there were some warts. And I remember getting one review and the reviewer said, if you attack Wyatt Earp, you attack America. I wasn't aware that I'd attacked Wyatt Earp, let alone America. In the fiction. Even my novels will have a bibliography in the back or some suggested titles that if you're interested in this kind of thing, here's a book or two that you might want to read the nonfiction. And I think that's important. I think the best fiction can raise curiosity in readers. They want to know more. And why not? I think that's a great thing. That's how we expand our knowledge. So I'm hoping if you like my novels, we'll suggest Elliot Arnold's fiction. We'll suggest some nonfiction. You can maybe be a starting point for some folks. And of course, there's always going to be people who say, I don't care if it's true or not. I don't want to think it's true, so it wasn't.
Right.
There were no bowling alleys in the frontier. That's it.
Well, it's amazing, as all of you know, that the West was being mythologized practically as those events were occurring.
Very much so. And America in particular, we don't have centuries and centuries of history to fall back on. And every nation, every civilized nation, in a sense, does create its own mythology, something to be proud of, something that represents us. It's always been my belief that the real story is more interesting than the stuff that's made up. Sometimes it's a little uncomfortable. We have what I term inconvenient history, and so we'll just pretend it didn't happen. I didn't want to write novels where the protagonist was simply a shining star, he without sin. Nobody's like that. I think that the most interesting characters in fiction, particularly series fiction, are folks who are flawed in some way, and we can watch them change and grow and learn from book to book. The Cash McClendon that arrives in Silver City is not the same one who was first running from St. Louis in Glorious. I like him a lot better, but he's still kind of a jerk in some ways, and we'll have to see if he can improve any further in the next book or two.
Well, one of the figures that is most mythologized and misunderstood and controversial is Geronimo, and he does feature in this book. I don't want to give it too much spoilers away, but talk a little bit about Geronimo.
In Buffalo Trail, the second book, I wrote a lot about Quanah Parker. And a lot of the response I got from readers, they were kind of surprised to see Quanah, to learn some things about him. And they certainly enjoyed him being in the book, and I thought I would certainly try to have another Native American out of history in this one. I also was always fascinated by John Clum, who became mayor of Tombstone and earlier was an Indian agent, and it's in this role that we meet him in this book. But I had not realized that Geronimo, who was called Goyafle, Geronimo was a name given to him by Mexicans during his raids there. His people called him Goyafle.
He who yawns.
Right. I introduced him in the beginning of the book and thought that was it. And let's just say, if you were surprised later in the book, when he makes a reappearance, I was surprised too. That's part of the fun of fiction, you know, you're writing it and you're going along, and all of a sudden your fingers type something completely unauthorized by your brain, and you think, well, this is interesting, I wonder what's going to happen now. So when you read Silver City, when you get to Goyafle the second time around, please know that just as you're wondering, what in the heck is going to happen now, that was how I felt. It was going to be interesting to see, and I sure hoped I thought of something good, because if I didn't, I was in trouble. But that was, I think, maybe the most fun I've had writing fiction. That moment when all of a sudden there he was again. Really? How can we work that in? And ultimately, we were able to do that.
So in 1874, interesting period because, you know, didn't Cochise die that year?
Right.
And so there was this big power grab in the Apaches. And his two sons were kind of, what, Nache, or whatever his name was,
Right.
and the other guy.
Tase.
They were not quite the up to the job.
Well, you know, that's a hard person to replace.
Yeah.
Goyafle certainly thought he was well qualified.
Right.
And some of his efforts to prove that didn't work out as well as he would have liked. And though the one here in this book is fictional, I really did base it on some things that happened. So the Geronimo you're going to see is not maybe the guy who was ubiquitous on all those Saturday afternoon westerns when we were kids, but I hope he's an interesting character and he's a lot more realistic.
Very, very divisive within the Apaches, right?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
And you've got to remember, this was the time when we had some Native Americans who absolutely thought we have to stop, we have to learn the other ways. You had your holdouts, we're going to live the way we've always lived, and you have some people who are kind of caught in the middle. And I don't think that's specific just to Native Americans in 1874. Every society has that. I mean, let's face it, that's what we're doing today. So maybe Geronimo is among our elected officials, at least in spirit, if not in person.
It's amazing, as I'm sure some of you know, didn't he march in Teddy Roosevelt's inaugural parade, Geronimo?
You know, I'm hoping in my fiction to introduce Teddy again at some point.
Right.
Talk about a colorful character. But in the meantime, I still have to say, you know, my hat's off to Ike Clanton. Ike has done so much for me in my books. Let's not judge him rashly on all the stupid things he did in life, because he's sure come through for me.
Now, you mentioned that this completes these three books.
Right.
Are you going to be writing some more historical fiction?
I think I probably will. I also write nonfiction, and I've got a nonfiction book that will be published in April, and I've already started my next nonfiction project. So I have to see what comes next and when it occurs. But there's lots of room for historical fiction, and I sure like writing it, so I hope to keep it up.
Well, I wanted to keep your publisher happy by focusing on Silver City for a good part of tonight. But how can we resist talking about your next project? So let's do it. The next project is a nonfiction book about Jim Jones and Jonestown. And wow, what a fascinating story. I can't wait to, I just got this. It's mine, you can't have it. But Jeff will be back here on April 26th to talk about this in depth. But tell us a little bit about it. I can't help but ask.
Sure. When I write nonfiction, I'm trying to look at different eras in American history. And when I wrote, for instance, The Last Gunfight, I really wanted to write about Western expansion. What really happened there? I wrote about Bonnie and Clyde, but I was really writing about the Dust Bowl, the Depression, what it was like to be poor. My last nonfiction book was about all the chaos in the 1960s. And that's really the decade I grew up in. And I think the terror of the times, the confusion was really forgotten. And so I always try to pick an iconic individual or event and use that person or incident to sort of bring readers into that time frame. And so my last book was called Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson. And spending 3 years with Charlie and his cohorts, you know, and spending a lot of time with them.
Travels with Charlie.
Yeah, but this was not a poodle. But when I finished that book, I found myself wanting to write about the 1970s. How does America move from all the confusion, all the craziness to the 1960s? What happens in the 1970s? And it seemed to me there were only two iconic events, individuals, that everybody will have heard something about. And first was Watergate. And there are no more books to be written about Watergate. I promise you, there ain't nothing new there. But the other thing is, don't drink the Kool-Aid, which has come into our lexicon, and it means, you know, don't be foolish and follow someone who doesn't deserve it. Don't blindly follow. And there's two problems with that. First, it wasn't Kool-Aid. And second, Jonestown was not a mass suicide. Over 900 people died, it's true. But a third of them were children who had no choice. A third were followers of Jim Jones who willingly took the poison. And the last third were basically murdered. They wouldn't take the poison and were held down and forcibly injected. And so if it's not true that, okay, it wasn't Kool-Aid, it wasn't a mass suicide, what in the hell happened? And how did we ever get to a point where some poor kid who's born in backwoods Indiana ends up in the jungles of Guyana with a huge following? People, it's inconvenient history to remember that Jim Jones at one point had hundreds of thousands of followers and devoted believers all through America. So anyway, this book is about Jim Jones. It's about the people who followed him. It's about the time and place in American history where someone like Jim Jones could emerge. And ultimately, it's the story of how demagogues operate, how they work against the best interests of their followers, and how the danger of blindly following anybody. And certainly we live in a modern era where we still have demagogues. Maybe if we understand Jim Jones a little bit better, we'll understand a little bit more why we have some provocation to fall for people who promise everything and can't possibly deliver.
Now, when you decided to write about him, were you kind of like most of us maybe possessed with just the bare facts that we all think we know?
I think the worst thing in the world a historian can do is write a book about a subject where you're convinced you already know everything there is about it. And all you're trying to do is list sources that back up what you already believe, and basically you're not writing an objective book, you're writing propaganda. I'm proud to say that my ignorance is overwhelming in almost every area. When I start writing a book, it's usually something about which I only know the bare essentials. I think if, as I go along, I'm learning amazing, surprising things, and that gets me excited and wanting to know more, then I can hopefully transfer that excitement to the readers. If you're asking people to pay a lot of money for your book and then spend a lot of time reading it, I think it's only fair that they believe that you have done your utmost to explore every side of it and try to present it as objectively as possible. That's what writers owe their readers. So I didn't know much about Jim Jones or Jonestown besides don't drink the Kool-Aid. And it has been a whirlwind 3 years. I have learned things I never would have imagined. I've been places I never thought I would go. And hopefully it's the kind of book you can read, and maybe you'll get a better sense of the time and the place and understand a very misunderstood event a little bit better.
One of the things you just said was really interesting, which is that, you know, the times, a particular time period creates these characters, or they arise at these very specific moments that perhaps they couldn't have arisen, you know, 20 or 30 years earlier.
Right.
Have you found that to be the case with Jim
Never
Jones?
more so than with Jim Jones. Jones's followers were not simply one type of person or one race. We always get the idea that only poor black people believed in him. And a lot of them did. But People's Temple was a mix of races, of backgrounds, of economic standards. And we're coming in a time in the 1970s, we're coming out of the 60s, where it seemed like anything could happen, right? Good or bad. But you've got to go back beyond that. The 1950s, you know, you've got the Happy Days TV show where everything was just perky and perfect. And it wasn't. If you grew up poor in the 1950s, there wasn't that much upward mobility possible. If you grew up black in the 1950s, you understood prejudice. If you grew up white and privileged in the 1950s and 60s, as we emerge in the 70s and there's this push for racial equality, it's quite possible you're going to start feeling guilty. And yes, I did all these terrible things, and what can I do to make up for it? Quite a high percentage of People's Temple members were young, educated, white men and women who thought that only by joining People's Temple and working to set a socialist example where everybody's equal could help make up for all the terrible advantages that had in their youth. Jones could play to that. On the other hand, if you're poor and black, he can remind you that maybe you had some relatives who swung from trees, who were lynched, that you're the grandchildren of former slaves who were whipped and impregnated by their white masters. A Jim Jones sermon, and there's thousands of tapes of his sermons. People's Temple taped everything. And Jim Jones would literally go on for 5 or 6 hours. And he didn't take bathroom breaks. He had a little bowl behind his pulpit. And he expected everybody else to sit and listen. And if you listen, it seems like he's just ranting and jumping from one thing to another to another. But then you dissect it. And cooler than hell, every one of his sermons is including something specific for people who want to believe that part of what he has to offer. So if you're a member of People's Temple, every Sunday when Father is preaching for 6 hours, at some point he is going to say things that you absolutely will be what you believe in. And he was a master psychologist. I hadn't understood that. There are still among us lots of People's Temple survivors, even though there's really only a few folks left from November 18th, 1978. Some of them tell their stories for the first time, and they are among the most intelligent people I have ever met in my life. We're not talking a bunch of drugged out zombies. Maybe that's the biggest surprise of all.
I was just going to ask you that. You know, coming out of the 60s and the sort of the counterculture and the hippie movement, you get into the 70s and there's perhaps the sense that that movement has failed, burnout,
Right.
sense of that. These weren't necessarily counterculture types that were flocking to him, were they?
Some of them were,
Some were.
and a lot weren't. But Jones always promoted the purpose of People's Temple, and that was to clothe the naked, feed the hungry, reach out to those most in need. Nobody joined People's Temple to get something. When you joined People's Temple, you gave up most of your possessions. But they weren't all sold so that Jim Jones could live in luxury. People's Temple many places in the country had their free restaurants where if you're hungry, you can come in and be fed at no charge. You didn't have to give any excuses. They had free drug rehabilitation programs. I have talked to people, particularly in the West Coast, who are now in their 60s, who will say, without Jim Jones and People's Temple, I wouldn't be alive. They had clothing giveaways, free. All these things cost money. If you joined People's Temple, you gave up most of your material possessions, but you saw how these things were being used to reach out for those even more in need. The members of People's Temple were some of the most generous-spirited people.
Was it an apocalyptic vision at first?
No. Jones started with a little storefront church in Indianapolis, in the ghetto. Built a following gradually. In the 1950s, Jim Jones was considered one of the leading civil rights figures in America. He actually was on a par, in a lot of ways, with Martin Luther King. Indianapolis was one of the most segregated cities in America. Almost single-handedly, he integrated Indianapolis years before the Civil Rights Acts made it mandatory. Jim Jones, before he descended into these awful things, did great things. And that's astounding. Maybe we ought to go back and talk about
back to Arizona. Well, actually, you were talking about westward expansion, and your project that you just briefly touched on, your next project, sounds like a fascinating one. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
my next nonfiction book, after spending 7 years with Charlie Manson and Jim Jones, I needed to change. And I thought I would write about some people who did something really positive. And from 1914 through 1924, 10 summers in a row, a group of friends set out to travel a little bit. The first roads were coming into place in different parts of America. And starting in 1914, most everybody in America who traveled used the train. By 1924, due in large part to the influence of these three men and their trips, the majority of Americans traveled by car. Their own schedule. They'd have to depend on a train coming into the station at a certain time. For the first time, there were motels by the side of roads. They were called motor camps at first, but you actually could stop. There were service stations along the highways. Before that, if you had a gas combustion car, you had to buy your gas from hardware stores that might sell you a gallon at a time. It literally, these men and these trips literally changed America. The first road trips ever, and we've remained an automobile nation since. And their names, these three guys who every summer would go mostly unexplored, undriven places, were Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and Harvey Firestone. And they called themselves the Vagabonds. And my next book is about those 10 summers and what they did. And I'm climbing in my car, and I'm trying as much as possible to drive on these roads that still remain, going to all the little towns and all the little historical societies, and I'm going to try to bring readers into those Model Ts from 1914 through 1924. And the best part is, nobody dies at the end. So this is going to be a lot of fun, and in a couple of years, I hope I'm back at the Poison Pen talking about the Vagabonds.
Now, did you find with these guys that, so much of the American spirit is about this wanderlust, this exploration thing. The West, all the mythology of the West kind of depends upon it in a certain degree. With these guys, did you find that there was the exploration angle, but also kind of a little self-interest in there too? They're building their empires. And
there's two other factors.
Yeah.
Much more than Edison, Ford understood that this was great public relations. Taking cars into parts of the country where cars were still mostly unknown. And not any cars, but his Model Ts, which were built to be affordable for the working man. So there was some self-interest, but there's another part of it that fascinates me. Because in these years, before television, before radio really, when you had mostly newspapers, if you were going to be getting word about other things, you can make the argument that Henry Ford and Thomas Edison were by far the two most famous Americans, even outstripping presidents and athletes. And so when they would travel to parts of the country where, the most famous person was the guy who'd won 2 consecutive terms as sheriff. And in chugged this line of model cars into the town square, and out hop Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone. Every once in a while they'd intimidate a president to come in with them. Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge. In fact, can I tell a joke from that time? This became a popular joke just after 19, don't hold me to it, I think like 1922 or 1923, but if I get the date wrong, it's only a year or so. The vagabonds decide for their summer trip, they're going to go up into Vermont and parts of New England. Ford had just bought the old Wayside Inn that Longfellow wrote about in his poetry, so he wanted to check that out. And President Coolidge was on a summer sabbatical at his old family home in Vermont. So the way the joke goes, there's a farmer, the rocky hillside of Vermont, working and pulling away. And he hears this strange noise he's never heard before. And there's this new road had just been put in. And damned if there isn't a Model T Ford just chugging down the road. And it breaks down right in front of the farmer. The farmer looks and, there's 4 guys in the car. And he goes over and says, well, looks like you folks are having some trouble with this newfangled machine, but, I'm pretty good with such things. Let me take a look, try to tell you what's wrong with it. I figure your problem's probably in the motor. And the man behind the wheel jumps out of the car and said, my name is Henry Ford, and I built this car, and there is nothing wrong with the motor. I goes, well, all right. It's not the motor. Chances are pretty good it's the battery. And this chubby older man, riding shotgun, gets out of the car and said, I'm Thomas Edison. And I invented that automobile battery, and my company made it, and there's nothing wrong with it. Okay. Well, there's only one other thing it could be. Clearly you're having a problem with the tires. And guy in the back, one of the 2 guys in the back seat jumps out and goes, sir, I'm Harvey Firestone. And I manufactured those tires, there's nothing wrong with them. And the farmer goes, well, hell, you say you're Henry Ford, you say you're Thomas Edison, you say you're Harvey Firestone, next goddamn thing you'll tell me is that little runt in the back seat's Calvin Coolidge. So
he was never heard from again.
This is we also want to look at celebrity America and how even then it could change, it could influence so many people. But it's a fun book, and I hope when it comes out you all will like reading it.
Well, and as a nice little segue back to this world, this celebrity that we're talking about, journalism and some of the I'm trying to shoot for the newspaper coverage of the Adobe Walls incident, and how your character was very famous for a little while, and how some of these participants, already this cult of celebrity was being built with the newspapers.
Right. Pretty much our entire consciousness is presented to us by outside sources. We all have the newspapers we read, the TV stations we watch. And to a certain extent, we believe things that we're told by other people. And hopefully we don't, but a lot of people do, right?
Yes, sir.
Right. Too many people. Too many people. Cash McClendon, having barely survived the Battle of Adobe Walls, certainly knew that he survived through luck and the fact that there were other better fighters all around him, but he finds himself in Mountain View suddenly the local celebrity because the newspaper prints an account after interviewing him about how McClendon shot, was it a dozen war chiefs all by yourself that you brought down? And the people read that and they believe it. And they're surrounding McClendon, you know, they want to shake his hand, he's a celebrity. And, you know, I didn't do that. Well, it was in the newspaper, it must be true. So there we go. I mean,
And then Hearst comes along not too long afterwards, right?
well, you know, if I keep this series up, I think Hearst probably is going to actually show up in person at some point. If I do continue the series, maybe next time I'm here, we can take a vote among the audience members and the customers of the Poison Pen. Who do you want to see next?
Howard Hughes, Hearst, I mean, the list goes on and on, right?
Well, as long as I can still keep Ike Clanton going for a while, that's what would make me happy.
How long did he survive?
Well, Ike managed to sneak his way out of death at the so-called gunfight at the OK Corral, and if he later came to grief, it was again because he was a damn fool and never got over it. But that's way in the future. He can still do lots of dumb things in my book. I am going to keep relying on him. It's nice to know I can count on Ike Clanton.
Let's open it up. Do you guys have some questions?
Yes, sir.
Did Billy Clanton or the McClurys have anything to do with Ike's abilities?
I liked the McClurys very much. I particularly liked Tom. I thought he was a good, decent guy who found himself in an impossible position. And Lord knows being Ike Clanton's brother could not have been an easy thing. We all know Ike Clantons. The people of very limited ability who think of themselves as geniuses and near gods and brag all the time and cause all kinds of trouble and never seem to realize that it's because they screwed up. It's always somebody else. Human nature doesn't change. And when I wrote The Last Gunfight, the two people I sympathized with most were Tom McClory and Virgil Earp. You know, who I think were really decent people. Frank was a hothead, you know, his pride was at stake, and of course, Ike was a complete idiot. And Ike lived and Tom died, and how fair is that? The Earps, as we know, a couple of them came, you know, were assaulted later on, and it was hard for everybody. How much were they influenced by Ike? Damned if I know. I don't think Ike was influenced by anybody because he would have thought he was already perfect, just the way he was. Yes, ma'am.
You said that one of your goals was to show us the West as it really was and get us interested in that. Well, I've read the first two, and they did just that. So every time I come here, I go to the southwest corner, and I'm reading my way through all the Southwest books, and there's some in the Poison Pen Press over there that are local, and that's the result of that.
Let me say two things. First of all, Poison Pen Press is wonderful, and please support it. We need that kind of press. There's not enough groups like them, and we're blessed to have them, and let's always support them. Number two, what are you personally doing tomorrow? Would you like to come to Bozeman, Montana with me so I can use you as an audience plant there?
Well, I might go with you somewhere, but not Bozeman, Montana.
Yeah, you know, 8 degrees tomorrow if I'm lucky.
And you gotta have my blessing.
I do want to say thank you very much. I can't think of anything a reader could tell me that would mean more, and I'm grateful to you for saying that.
Yeah, it's true.
Anybody else?
Well, in that case, if everybody would like to buy about 100 copies of the book each, that would be a wonderful thing. Thank you for coming. Thank you for reading my books. But one other important thing, please keep supporting the Poison Pen. We need independent bookstores. This is a great one. For people like me who are writers, there's no better place to come. And for you readers, you're blessed having you here. Let's keep supporting them. And I hope you keep coming back for years and years and years.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Let's give them a nice warm round.
Personally think people who drag in late are disgraceful.
Yeah.
Thanks, gang. If anybody does want a book signed, I'd be happy to sign one. Or two, or three.
We've got a table set up back here for you.